10 years ago, the United Kingdom voted to leave the European Union in a referendum that fundamentally reshaped politics, economics, and diplomacy across Europe. What began as a domestic political decision rapidly became one of the most significant events in the history of the European project, raising profound questions about sovereignty, identity, integration, and the future direction of the EU itself. A decade on, much of the debate in the UK continues to focus on whether Brexit has delivered on its promises. However, this anniversary also offers an opportunity to examine Brexit through a European lens. How did the referendum and its aftermath shape the European Union? What lessons did Brussels and member states take from the UK's departure? And has Brexit strengthened the EU's sense of unity, altered its global role, or changed the way it approaches future challenges? To help us reflect on these questions, I'm delighted to be joined by Sören Haar, managing partner of EACON and our partner in Brussels. Drawing on his experience observing EU policy making and politics from the heart of Europe. Sören, you're going to offer insights into how Brexit has been viewed across the continent, what has changed in the relationship between the UK and the EU over the last decade, and what the future may hold for both sides. Sören, thanks for joining us today. As we mark 10 years since the Brexit vote, let me start by asking, when you look back on the events of 2016, what stands out as the most significant and enduring consequence of Brexit from an EU perspective?
Well, Ben, first thing I would like to say is that there is actually very little talk about Brexit, and even the topic of EU-UK relationship is quite marginal in Brussels these days, apart, of course, from people who are professionally very affected. So somehow Brexit, after 10 years, looks like something back there in the shelves and history. Now, when people really think about it, I think there is a certain degree of sadness because a whole generation of people here in Brussels have grown up in the belief that the EU would always grow and maybe one day really reach the limits of the borders of Russia and maybe Turkey. So that was really with what we were all growing up here, two generations at least of people were growing up with. And this objective of one day covering the whole of Europe was almost like enshrined in the EU treaties as well. It was simply not foreseen that a member state leaves the EU, and finding out one day that joining the EU may be something reversible has been a big disappointment for many people, I think. And then, of course, there is the time that has happened since, and when Europeans look at how Brexit unfolded from a European perspective, it doesn't really look like a success story. And that has also, of course, from a Brussels perspective, something positive, because it's a signal to other people doubting about EU membership and raising questions. It's, however, something that probably shows them that the purely national pathway is not ideal either.
That's really interesting. You talked about the sense of sadness, from the EU member states, and I suppose 10 years is a long time. A lot has happened, since Brexit and the UK leaving the EU. There's war on the continent in Russia, Ukraine. There's a lot of change afoot. Obviously, is there a Brexit legacy still within the European Union, or has it very much moved on, and the EU is focusing on matters at hand?
Well, I think the Brexit legacy is there. I think it inspires a little bit. The experience of negotiating with Britain somehow led to also a process where Europeans were starting to think again, what's the essential thing in the European Union? What is it at the core that we want to protect? And so there has been a process of a healthy process, I would say, of evaluation and being clear about objectives and what the benefits of membership are. And I think you see that also in the way the EU is positioning itself internationally at the moment. Before Brexit, people were always saying, well, without the UK, there would be a lot of protectionism in Europe, etc. And all this has not happened at all. On the contrary, Europe is really chasing trade agreements with all parts of the world to react to changes in the rules of global trade and economic flows. So I think that's the positive side of Brexit, certainly, that Europe has a clearer picture of what it really wants from itself.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because I had never thought about, kind of Brexit strengthening the EU as a political project. But I suppose looking back 10 years, I remember, and I worked in Brussels 15 years ago, I remember that there was a healthy level of Euroscepticism within the EU. Has that continued, that European skepticism, or do you think that's kind of died, along the way? And so has that European or Euroscepticism gone?
No, it's not gone. And I think many people remain skeptical somehow because they associate, rightly or wrongly, they associate Brussels with, I think, developments that scare people in other countries as well. When you look at the US, for instance, so people, I think, they are questioning probably certain tendencies in globalization. They are questioning the concept of market economies, of economic liberalism, and of course they have always a lack of trust when decisions are taken very far from home. So that is still there. But on the other hand, I think people, citizens, also understand that the world is changing and that the wind blows very cold at global level, that you cannot trust even old relationships anymore. When we look across the Atlantic to what's happening in the US, we see the rise of China, we see the aggression of Russia. And I think people understand that in such a world we are living in, it feels, however, safer to be part of a community with strong solidarity that is enshrined in treaties, rather than staying outside in the cold alone and relying only on what happens in their own capital. So I think people make this difference. They still have questions, but the big wave of Euroscepticism is behind us. When you look at even very traditionally very Eurosceptical parties like for instance, the Rassemblement National in France or the AfD in Germany, no one, even there, is questioning membership in the EU anymore. So they are pushing for a rebalance of power, maybe between Brussels and capitals, but you don't hear anyone asking for leaving the EU anymore in basically any EU member state.
So in effect, what you're saying from my reading of it is that, Brexit has actually led to unity and solidarity within the EU. Would that be correct?
Yes, absolutely. Solidarity has risen again, and it's often, I mean, when you look back at European history, often a lot of progress has been made when the external pressure was very big. When you go back to EU history, the first big phase was in the 1950s under the threat of war in Korea, when many Europeans thought what happens in Korea at the moment could happen in the heart of Europe tomorrow. Another strong phase was in the 1970s when the first oil crisis unfolded. There was a strong phase also in the 1980s and early 1990s when communism broke down, and the question was, how can we in the future organize this continent to keep it peaceful and make it prosper economically? So often best phases of EU integration actually have resulted from external pressure. And I have a little bit the impression this mechanism functions again today.
Interesting. So as we're looking back then, that kind of disentanglement of the UK as an EU member state, after 40 plus years of integration, from what you've seen and heard and from speaking to people, was that disentanglement difficult? And I suppose what has the EU learnt from the UK leaving the EU?
Yes, it was a very difficult process, we have to say, because there was no blueprint for such a situation. It's important to understand that, and many people have not traditionally understood it, and wherever it is. But the fundamental rule of the European Union is that everything has to be based on treaties, black and white, written down on paper. So when there is no mandate for the EU to act in a particular field, for instance, the EU cannot act and may not act and doesn't have the right to act. And if it did, however, then there would be immediately someone to challenge that in the courts. So the EU is a very rule-based community, and the treaties had no scenario. There was nothing in the treaties describing the process that had to be followed if a member state wants to leave the European Union, because nobody had foreseen that. No one had imagined that when the treaties were written. So
it really was picking the EU project out line by line, which mustn't have been easy or straightforward. But one thing I am fascinated by, the UK was always seen as one of the big beasts within the EU, alongside Germany and France. Has that changed the balance of power 10 years on? Is it very much Germany and France still calling the shots now that the UK, which is seen as a bit of a balance of power there, because they've gone now?
Yes, of course. If you take one power center out, logically, the remaining ones, they gain power. And this is what has happened. Probably Germany has never been as influential as EU's largest member state. France has a lot of weight. Italy has gained in power. And even Poland, I would say, has gained in relative power, also based on its economic success. So this redistribution of power has clearly taken place.
Interesting. I suppose at the start of our conversation, Sören, you talked about, the EU having to rethink, its enlargement because of the UK leaving, and I suppose the initial shock of the UK leaving 10 years ago. Has Brexit now changed how the EU thinks about enlargement, particularly in relation to candidate countries, in the Balkans or in Ukraine? Has Brexit changed that?
I don't think Brexit has changed a lot the way the EU looks at enlargement. I mean, the one thing is the fundamental promise in principle to all European nations: if you want to join our community one day, and once you fulfill the conditions, you are welcome to join, and you should be part of the family. So that promise is still there. Now, what has changed is, of course, the experience with past rounds of enlargement. And so many capitals today are more careful, want to give it more time, want to have more guarantees that countries do not enter and then try to break the rules, this type of thing. Then there is a geopolitical pressure on making sure maybe that Europe, for instance, the Balkans become really European countries based on European values and do not become the proxies of Russia or China or someone else. So these things play a role, but I don't think Brexit has really changed a lot the perspective on enlargement.
Interesting. I suppose I obviously come from Northern Ireland, and one of the key issues of Brexit were some of the sensitive issues around Northern Ireland during the Brexit negotiations. From your perspective, Søren, how is the EU now assessing the operation of the Windsor Framework and then the ongoing UK-EU relations more broadly?
Well, I think Brussels is of the opinion that the Windsor Framework works pretty well. It's a pragmatic compromise. And actually, I think seen here from Brussels, it works more smoothly than maybe most people had expected. There is less political tension. Trade seems to function more or less. But of course, Brussels also reminds very often that it needs to be implemented faithfully and respecting the rules of the game and the rules that have been agreed. So Brussels is keeping an eye on how it unfolds on the ground.
Yeah, interesting. I suppose looking ahead, I suppose, or looking into the future. Has Brexit influenced public opinion towards the EU among its citizens and member states over the past decade, or as you kind of touched on earlier on, has Brexit gone? It's at the back of the memory. The EU is very much focused on the continuation of the European project. Is Brexit no longer there? It's just the EU-UK reset is ongoing. The UK hasn't drifted off into the Atlantic. It's a trading partner, and the EU is starting to adapt to that kind of new relationship.
Yes, when you look at public opinion, there was indeed a phase where Euroscepticism was growing, and that was probably around the time of the referendum in 2016. And when you look at the figures now, because there are regular polls, EU-wide polls, asking people, what do you think about the EU? Do you think EU membership is beneficial for your country? And you see that there is a constant rise in support for the EU since that period. Now Brexit is only one of the experiences probably that influences Europeans. There is the COVID-19 pandemic, for instance, that played a role apparently in increasing support for EU membership. There was another step caused by Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine that again led to a situation where more Europeans became supportive. So at the moment we have pretty stable figures. 75% of Europeans support EU membership fully. So the figures are quite good, and I think Brexit was not the only and maybe not the most important factor, but one of the factors why Europeans see the EU more positively than they did 10 years ago.
Interesting. So if the referendums to take place today rather than in 2016, Søren, do you think there would be different arguments made by both sides now that we have hindsight?
Yeah, that's a good question. Probably, I think the security aspect would play a much stronger role, because the biggest change, maybe when we look around ourselves, is that Europe's security situation has not improved at all. And so I think this would be something that both sides would have to integrate into their argumentation. They would have to show that staying inside or staying outside is the better solution to provide security guarantees for the country. And of course, when you look at what is going on, that in this field, both the UK and the EU are trying to strengthen their links very actively. Probably that would have benefited mainly the Remain campaign and not so much the Leave campaign.
I suppose what we can see, following the Labour government getting into power just over 2 years ago under Keir Starmer and now Prime Minister Burnham, a closer UK-EU relationship beginning to take hold. Has that been felt in Brussels? Because certainly from an Anglo-Irish relationship, both the UK and Ireland are far closer 2 years on from the Labour government coming into power than I suppose initially post-Brexit, where things were very tense and there was a real lack of engagement on a UK-Ireland, but also on a UK-EU relationship. Do you see that closer working relationship now? How do you think the UK-EU summit in the next number of months is going to play out?
Yes, I think it's encouraging from a European perspective, to see that the UK is ready to make more steps in Europe's direction. I think that's very welcome. We need these solutions in many areas, and in the end, it's about our common problem-solving capacity in so many areas, whether that is security or climate change or keeping a rule-based international order in place. There are so many things that the European Union and the UK share and support, that it's only logical that more collaboration is sought. And probably the fact that people in the UK see that America is not at all an alternative anymore, that this special relationship simply doesn't exist anymore, probably also helps to an unideological view on both sides of the channel and finding practical solutions. So I think the door is open for the UK and the new government to find additional solutions, first of all in those areas which are already on the negotiation tables, but then also maybe beyond and in a longer term perspective.
Interesting, you kind of touch on the kind of the challenging relationship across the Atlantic with America, and that kind of political fragmentation that we're seeing play out alongside kind of the societal polarization that we're seeing both in the UK, but also in member states. If after 10 years of watching Brexit unfold in the heart of Europe, and you kind of touched on the EU is moving on to other things, what's the one thing, Sören, that both from your perspective, both Brexit supporters and opponents still misunderstand about how the EU viewed the referendum and its aftermath?
Well, I'm not following every day of the intense discussions in the UK. I think, as I said, the subject is much more prominent in British discussions than it is in Brussels. But one thing that was always, I think, fundamental to understand is that the EU functions so much based on written rules, and that it cannot grab some competencies here and there suddenly. And this is also a good thing for, if you ask, well, how is Brussels maybe benefiting from the absence of?
Well, we could have a whole different conversation about that, Sören. 10 years is a long time in politics. I'm sure we can both agree, but there are certainly challenges with all that. Look, Sören, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Really interesting conversation, and hopefully we catch up in person soon.
A great pleasure. That would be nice, Ben.